For the second video in this series, we'll be adding the SQL database and the tables. I've produced two versions of this second video. This is the long version where we'll be creating the tables manually. In the shorter version, we create the tables using a SQL script. So as I say, this is the long version. Let's look at the SQL. Start SQL Management Studio. And connect to the server. If Object Explorer isn't visible, go to View and then select Object Explorer. Click on the plus sign next to the databases and we'll see our existing databases. We want to add a new one, so right-click on Databases, Add New Database, and we're going to call it Purchase Orders. Accept all the other defaults and click OK. We're going to be adding the tables manually, so select the Purchase Orders database, click the little plus sign, select Tables, and right-click and select New and Table. Now we'll start off by adding the tax table. So we're going to have a column called Tax ID, and it's going to be an integer, and we're not going to allow nulls. And let's just move this up. That's going to be created automatically by the system. We want it auto-generated, and that's an identity specification. So we change this no to yes. And let's move this up a little bit more. We can see that it's incrementing 1 and the seed is 1, i.e. it's starting at 1. The next we want is tax description. That's going to be an n varchar 50, and we're not going to allow nulls. The next one is the tax rate. That's going to be decimal, and the precision is going to be 6, and the scale is 4. That's basically saying that we're going to have a maximum of six numbers, and we're going to have 4 after the decimal point. Now, since this is going to be nearly always, well, it's going to be a percentage. So in all probability, it's going to be, if for VAT in the UK, it's going to be 0.20. But in the past, we have had 17.5%, so that would be 0.175. So we've got to allow for at least 3 decimal places. So if we give ourselves plenty of room by allowing six characters in total and 4 after the decimal place, that should be sufficient. We aren't going to allow nulls though, and the default, we want to because we're not allowing nulls, we must give it a default, so we'll set it to 0. Next one is taxes archived. That's going to be a bit to allow true or false. We're not going to allow nulls, and the default value is going to be 0, which is not archived. So that's it for the tax table. So let's save that. And we'll just call it tax. Let's just do a refresh. We'll see we've now got the tax table there. Right, add another one, new table. Let's make this the supplier. So we want a supplier ID. It's going to be an integer. We're not going to allow nulls. And as before, the ID is going to be an auto incrementing. So its identity specification needs to be set to yes. Then we need a supplier name. Make sure you spell these right. And varchar 50. We're not going to allow a supplier to be entered without a name. Then we're going to add this address. And varchar 50 again, but we are going to allow nulls. I think I can probably copy that. Oh. And we're going to have 3 lines of address. And I seem to have made a real mess of the one above it. Postcodes aren't normally 50 characters long, so we'll make that just 10. Then we want the supplier email. And they can be quite long, so we're going to put that at 256 characters. And we are going to allow nulls. And lastly, supplier is archived. Bit with a we're not going to allow nulls and a default of 0. What am I doing here? That keeps on going wrong. Right, supplier ID, name, address, 123, postcode, email, and is archived. That looks fine. No, it isn't. I forgot to make that the primary key. So make that the primary key and then save it. And this is supplier. I forgot to make the ID the primary key on this one. So I'll do that while I remember it and save that. Right, let's add the product table. So product ID, integer, underline nulls, and we want it auto incrementing. Product code. And our char will allow 25 characters for that. And we won't allow it to be null. Product description comes next. We won't allow nulls for that either. product unify will have as money. We won't allow nulls, and we'll give it a default value of 0. Now we want the product, keep on spotting spelling mistakes, the product record to have a cross-reference to the supplier. So we want product supplier ID. That's going to be integer. Now I am going to allow nulls for that because we might have situations where we want a generic product and don't want to tie it in specifically to a particular supplier. And product is archived. Bit not null and default value of 0. And I'm not going to fall into the trap of forgetting to make that the primary key. Right, so that's looks okay. I can't spot any spelling mistakes. I'll just save it, and this is going to be called product. Next one is the purchase order header. We've now got our 3 lookup tables. Now we can actually enter the information for the order itself. So PO header, and I'm just going to copy that. ID, integer, we're not going to allow nulls, and we want that to be auto incrementing. And while I'm here, I'll make that the primary. Next, we want order number. That's going to be an integer, and it's not going to be null, and we'll have a default value of 0. Order date. We're not going to allow that to be null. Who the supplier is. That's going to be a cross-reference, and that's not going to be allowed to be null either. But I will allow the address to be left as null. Sometimes you've got a supplier, you just phone them up and place the order that way. You may not have the supplier address. You said the postcode could be 10. Supplier email. That can be 256. I'll have requested by. Now this is peculiar. That's probably going to be coming from the authentication database, and I've done a bit of homework on that, and it seems that the key to the user in the authentication database is a GUID, and that can be up to 450 characters, so we've got to make that a pretty large field. And lastly, actually that should have just been PO header requested by. And lastly, we want PO header is archived, bit can't be null, and it's 0. Right, ID, order number, order date, supplier ID, address 123, and postcode, email, requested by, and is archived. That looks right, so save it. And this is PO header. And lastly, we want the PO line. So this is where we're going to be recording the line details of each purchase order. So PO line ID, not going to allow nulls, and we're going to make it identity. Cross-reference to the purchase order header. Not going to allow nulls on that. And we may as well put a default in there of 0. We're going to record the product. Here, which is going to be an integer. And we're also not going to allow that to be null. Product description. We're also not going to allow that to be null, so whoever is entering the purchase order must put in a purchase product description. Now, the product quantity, I think we're going to want that to be a decimal. And again, we're going to allow ourselves a bit of flexibility here with a precision of 9 and a scale of 3, i.e. up to 3 decimal places. I don't know whether that's realistic or not, but we'll use that to start with. The unit price of the item, we can have money for that. We're also not going to allow that or the quantity to be 0. So put that in. Put the default in for the quantity. Not quite sure what happened there. And lastly, the PO line. tax rate. I have a default of 0, but we'll have, this has got to match the uh, precision and scale on the VAT itself. We aren't going to have, that's not going to be the PO line. It's not going to be a cross-reference to the tax rate ID. It's going to be the actual tax rate. And again, the reason for that is that we want to record the actual tax rate that we're using on this particular purchase order line. If the tax rate changes in the future, we don't want this to be recalculated using some future tax rate. So we've got to kind of fix it at the actual rate at the point at which the purchase order line was created. Right, I better make sure I've made that the primary key. So line ID, header ID, product ID, product description, product quantity, product unit price, and tax rate. So that all seems fine. So that's the purchase order line. And now we need to enter the foreign keys. So let me just refresh this. On the header, the PO header, we've got a reference to the supplier. So we'll start by looking at that. And if we click up this on this button that says relationships and then select add, in this item here, tables and column specifications, we want to select the supplier, and the supplier ID is matched on the PO header against obviously the supplier ID. That's it for that one. On the product, we've also got a reference to the supplier, so we select design and repeat it. This is again supplier, and it's the supplier ID. It's going to match the supplier ID on the product. On the line, let's look at that. We've got a reference to the header ID and the product ID. I should say that we aren't going to be enforcing on any of these foreign keys. We're not going to be enforcing any referential integrity. They're all, the cross references are all automatically allocated numbers, and we aren't going to be changing any. I therefore don't think we need to worry about the cascading updates or deletes. In fact, I do wonder whether we need these at all, but since we've added them, we may as well keep them. So let's just save that. And I think that's it. I think we've got all the foreign keys there that we need. So that's it. So we've now added the database, added all the tables, and added the foreign keys. We've put in the primary keys. We've put in the defaults where necessary. Um, so the next stage is to look at the visual code. This has been a bit of a long video. Hopefully it's described in detail what's on the various tables, but I should add that the much quicker way to do all this is to use the shortened version, which just uses the SQL script of the Blazor Code website. Thank you, and let's move on to the next.